Today, in organizational behavior, we're going to study the incredible process of perception, our ability to go from raw sensory inputs, the blips of sights and sounds and smells and touches and tastes, to forming some relatively accurate, organized body of knowledge of the world around us so that we can negotiate our way and make sense. We seem to have, as humans, this driving need to make sense of this world that we live in. And if we don't make sense of it immediately, then these perceptual processes somehow allow us to impose a sense of order over it. So what is this perceptual process that I'm referring to? It actually has a number of sub-processes in it. It consists of detecting sensory stimuli, then selecting those that we detect, organizing them, interpreting them to make, as I mentioned before, sense of the world around us. Let's start with detection. What is this detection business? Well, in part, it depends on the power of the sensory input. And in part, it depends on our own psychological states. Sometimes these stimuli, the sights, the sounds, the smells, are so compelling that we can't resist turning our attention to them. For example, you're driving. You hear a siren. It turns your attention towards the siren. You were either listening to radio, you were lost in your own thoughts, you were talking to somebody else. And now the siren intrudes, and we start scanning the environment to see where that sound is coming from so that we can behave in some intelligent way. Or you're walking along by yourself with somebody else, again, lost in thought, immersed in conversation, and a sight appears that is so compelling that you can't resist turning your attention to it. It's so unusual, and so you turn around and you take a look. And you may even mention to the person you're with to make sure that somehow you weren't alone in capturing it. Did you catch that? And you remember that scene, that person, whatever it is, that caught your attention. Or there you are working on your computer, trying to get a paper done, and some smells waft in from the kitchen. And again, captures your attention. And you jump up and go running into the kitchen to see what it is that's being cooked in the kitchen. All of these ways of capturing our attention, of enabling us to detect a stimulus based on the properties of the stimulus itself, we refer to as bottom-up processing. But that's not the only thing that enables us to detect. Sometimes the detection is driven by our own interests, our own motives, our own fears. And so, again, it becomes easier for us to detect certain things because we're interested in those things. You're traveling on the road. You know you're going into New York City. You're going to be keyed into all the traffic reports. From all of the noise that goes on the radio, it's the traffic reports that will attract your attention. Nothing's particularly different about the traffic reports in terms of the person's voice, but you're interested in it, and so you more readily detect it. Interests in terms of determining what it is that you detect. Another aspect is selection, because we're bombarded by an array of stimuli. And we detect an awful lot of them, but we don't pay attention to them. They go. You can't possibly pay attention to everything. You'd go crazy trying to pay attention to everything. We need to, through the process of attention, select things that are important to us. And you let the other stuff go by. Not important unless for some reason somebody calls your attention to it. There are a lot of things that you're sensing, even detecting right now, that you're not paying attention to. Small example, the weight of the clothes on your body. Until I called your attention to it, you didn't give it a second thought. You let that go out of attention, and you're focusing your attention on what's going on in the classroom, something that's more important for you. Okay? We need to select various stimuli out there. And what causes us to select various stimuli? Most of the time, it's our interests, our motivations, our expectations, and sometimes our fears. And when it comes from something internal, as I've been describing, we often think of something as top-down processing. And so perception consists of a combination of bottom-up processing and top-down processing, depending on the power of the stimuli and depending on our own psychological states at any one time. And they vary. They vary from time to time. And we take all of these things and we organize them and interpret them into something that becomes meaningful. Okay, let's take a look at this drive that we have to organize things into something that becomes meaningful. We have on screen something that some of you may consider is just some kind of amorphic, disorganized array of blacks and whites and grays. No meaning to it. We stare at it and we stare at it, and there still isn't any meaning. But if you continue to stare a while, and somebody instructs you that maybe there really is an image there, something all of a sudden may pop out at you. And this popping out in this case, I don't know if you've got it yet or not, could be a cow. A cow? Where in this mess can you find a cow? Let's try to get a look. Okay, starting over here, I'm going to be tracing the top of the cow's head. Come around and pick up an ear. And now I'm profiling the face. Coming down like this. This mess here could be a nose. Come back up here, the other side of the face, and along a kind of lopped off ear, and we're back at the head again. And over here, we could see the back. If you started from amorphous black, gray, white blobs on a piece of paper that appeared to be random and had no organization, and now wind up with cow, where did the change take place? Not on the piece of paper. I didn't do anything to it. It was all your hard work, your drive to make some sense out of something that apparently seemed senseless to begin with. And you reconfigured, and you built contours, and you built boundary lines, and now it's organized into something that's a lot more meaningful. That's the easy one. Now, let's try something more difficult. Okay. Some of you may look at this and again say, another array of random black splotches on a white background. But somebody else might look at it and say, it's a Dalmatian. Right. John, you want to come up here and prove to people that we're not kidding them, that there really is a way to construct and configure a Dalmatian out of all of this? Okay, John's tracing along the back and is now coming along the hind quarters down to one hind leg. Okay, and to another hind leg. Okay, and front legs and around the face. Okay, and what we've got then is a Dalmatian. Again, no changes made, and if you now see the Dalmatian, if the boundary lines help you a little bit, again, you've gone through that constructive, dynamic process in which you build something meaningful out of something that essentially started as something fairly meaningless. A process that we go through constantly. We're constantly taking these bits of sights and sounds and scanning them and going from meaningless to meaningful. And we do this bringing to bear all our previous experience, all our previous expectations on whatever is the sight that we're looking at the time. And for humans, I have to add that vision is really the primary one. Again, dealing with organization, let's take a look at this scene. Well, somebody want to try a hand at describing what's there? What have we got?
Looks like a family enjoying some quality time.
A family enjoying quality time. Good interpretation. Okay, let me ask a next question. Is this family enjoying the quality time inside or outside?
Looks like they could be inside.
Inside. Okay. Does anybody disagree with this in the class?
It could be on a porch.
It could be on a porch, okay. But basically, I'm going to make a guess that most of you looking at this tend to see it as being something interior. Now, why would we decide that it's interior? What are the clues? And we're making judgments. Yeah.
The window. You look out the window. You kind of
Okay,
see
there's something here. It's a window.
plant life.
Okay, I'm with you. I mean, if I had to make a judgment on this, I'd judge it as being an interior room as well. And we have this structure over here. How do we make sense of this thing?
Column or support.
A column or supporting beam, right. Okay, and so what we're doing basically is interpreting this from experience that we've had with rooms that we've known before. And we bring it to this situation.
Also the furniture.
And the furniture, it looks like indoor furniture, right. It doesn't look particularly like. And the other interpretation that we had here was a porch. Okay, but again, not too far outside the house, something close to the house. And yet when this picture was shown to people in other cultures, in cultures in Africa where people were used to more outside living, there was a different interpretation. Again, it was seen as a family quality time. Families are pretty universal. But it was seen as being outside. And what were the cues for being outside in all of this? Now we need to reconstruct and reinterpret. Well, there's some cultures where women tend to carry boxes on their heads. We would always interpret this as a window. But there's an alternative interpretation if you look at it. She could be seated outside on a cushion carrying a box on her head, and this could be interpreted as some schematic of a tree. We wouldn't necessarily tend to interpret that way because that's not our cultural experience. We spend more of our life indoors than we do outdoors, okay? And we bring our own experience of rooms to this situation. And so again, we organize and we interpret based on our previous transactions. What this means is because everybody has a slightly different history, slightly different stories, the interpretation of what we see out there may not be exactly the same as somebody else's. We may see things and understand them slightly differently. By and large, within a culture, you come to have agreement. How do we know that people agree on things? Well, we don't go around bumping into things. We don't go around slugging it out with people and misinterpretations of things. We tend to be able to communicate fairly well about the basics in our object environment around us. You know, we drive cars and everybody seems to pretty much adhere to the rules and perceive things fairly well. We walk along sidewalks and we don't go around bumping into people too frequently, so that there's an understanding that there is some common agreement. And we also refer to perception, as I mentioned before, as a very dynamic process. That means that we are constantly interpreting sensory inputs. They're coming in all the time, and so they're always changing. That makes it dynamic. And the judgments depend on variations in ourselves, in other people, in the situation. So we've got a lot of variables here, and variables vary, change. The process is dynamic, and the process is also constructive. And when I say constructive, it's that internal construction that I talked about when we were taking a look at the cow and the dog. The change wasn't in the external environment, the construction was internally. So a basic introduction to the perceptual process. We need to organize all of these various things. And how do we go about organizing them? Well, there were some principles proposed in the early part of the century by some psychologists in Germany who call themselves the Gestalt psychologists, from the German word Gestalt, meaning pattern. The notion that the whole is basically greater than the sum of the parts. And we're not going to look at all of their principles, but we're going to look at a few of them in object perception and take a look at how they affect the way we, again, organize visual, and it could carry over to auditory, but we're going to stick with visual in this classroom, the world around us. One of the principles that they talked about is something called proximity. Proximity says that we group things together because they are close to each other. Grouping because of closeness. Example. On proximity. Okay, if we simply look at this one, well, let's see a bunch of lines. I've got a volunteer to describe how you see these lines.
You see 6 lines, and they seem to be grouped in pairs. There's parallel lines, just in 3 different sets there.
Right, and probably everybody is going to agree with you. If I ask the question, I see people nodding their heads. And it is, we're grouping things together because of closeness to each other. So we don't just see 6 lines, but we see lines grouped in pairs, or we see 3 columns out there. Column 1, column 2, and column 3. And that happens because we tend to cluster things together just because they're close to each other. A second principle is that of similarity. And the principle of grouping according to similarity says that we group things together because they're similar to each other. We've got somebody here to describe, again, what you see up there. Yeah.
Circles and triangles.
Okay, you see circles and triangles. So what you're seeing then are, again, columns of triangles, column of circles, column of triangles. Column, triangles, circles. Okay, and we don't see rows. We tend not to group them together in terms of rows of alternating triangle, circle, triangle. So grouping things together because they're similar. Okay, we walk into a room, we scan a room, and we tend to put people together without even knowing if they're together, often on the basis of some similarity that we think we detect in them. Yet another principle is that of closure. Okay, and again, does anybody have any interpretation of those blobs on the screen? Yeah?
It looks like a shell.
It looks like a shell. Okay, commonly people will look at that and say a shell. You could say, really, it's just a lot of blotches, black on white. Okay, there's nothing there that has boundary lines on it, and yet, because we are driven to make sense of the world around us, we engage in this process called closure. We close, we erect boundary lines even when there aren't boundary lines, and we make sense of it. We add interpretation to it based on knowledge of other things that we have. And we make matches all the time based on our previous history and experience. We see something there and we take a glance at that, and we go back into the vast array of objects we know from memory. And this best matches something that would be called a seashell. So we interpret it as a seashell. We are so driven to make sense of everything that we draw lines even when lines are not there. So what have we got here? I mean, I know that there's circles. Yes?
Cube.
A cube, okay? And yet it's not a complete cube. So where do we make sense in terms of making this a cube? Well, we construct what we call subjective contours. This is in our brain where all of this is going on. We're adding meaning to all of this so that it appears to make sense. And we continue to construct lines here and lines here, etc., throughout all of this. Okay, now this is interesting. This is called a Necker cube, and in fact, it's one of those things that can be reversible on you. If you stare at it long enough, you might begin to see back and rear edges flipping back and forth on you. Very often, this X line will be seen as a front edge of the cube. Here's one, bottom, top, side, side. But if you stare at it long enough, it may reverse and become a back edge of the cube. One of these ambiguous images that we have called reversing figure. But what I really wanted to point out was this process of closure. Our ability to draw subjective contour lines on images, and I'm not sure this is going to particularly turn up here, but when we draw those subjective contours through the white space to make the bars continue and form the cube, we may actually see that white within the subjective contours that we've constructed whiter than the background white. Physically, that's not the case, but psychologically, we've engaged in this constructive process again to make sense of the environment around us. So dynamic and constructive, and the need to make sense. Yet another principle that we have to deal with, if we go back to our listing of principles, is something called figure ground. The figure ground principle of perception. The figure ground principle says that first, we organize our sensory fields, in this case, again, I'm talking visual, but not necessarily held to that, we segregate it into a figure which is slightly in front of a background. So the figure is slightly in front of the background. We presume that the background is continuous. We make an assumption, even though we don't see it, and I'm going to give you a visual of this in just a minute. And finally, the edges belong to the figure. We put the edges on the figure and not the background. Let's take a look at one of these, and in this case, it's going to be also a reversible figure ground. We got it all in? Okay. What have we got here? What kind of an image have we got here? Somebody want to venture? You're looking at that. What do you see? Yeah.
A girl holding a candlestick.
A girl holding a candlestick in front of her. Okay. Yeah.
I see two people looking at
And two people looking at each other. It could be one or the other, depending on how you're isolating the space and what you're determining as figure and what you're determining as ground. First, let's go with the candlestick. And it's hard to ignore that candlestick. It's right in the middle there. Okay, we can see the candle up here. Okay, and it traces down here. And so we could see a girl's face possibly in back of the candlestick. If we see this as a candlestick, then the edges are clearly part of the candlestick. And the girl's face, we presume to be continuous and slightly in back of the candlestick. But wait, it could be two girls looking at each other. Now, where do we get this from? To construct that image, and I'm using the word construct again, okay, we need to have the girls in profile. And here's forehead. We're coming down on bangs, okay, brow. And now this becomes a nose, and we have lips and chin, okay, and one very large eye. And the reverse is over here. Once we do that, if you're able to make it, flip it into two girls, and with these reversibles, they're going to go back and forth on you very quickly. You won't actually see two things at once. You're just reversing very quickly. But if you see the two girls looking, then what you've got are the edges now adhering to the girls and becoming part of the brow, becoming part of the nose. And that just becomes kind of a white space that recedes as background. Okay? Figure and ground. But we need to do this constantly to make sense of the world. We have to select those things that are important and make them figure and let the other stuff go and become background. Just because these are fun, let's go for one more. Some of you may be familiar with this, and it's yet another reversible figure ground. And remember, we're not changing anything in the image, but it changes what we see depends on how we configure the white and the black space. So what have we got here? Yeah?
An older lady and a younger lady.
Okay. Kelly, do you want to come up and trace things out so that people who have not yet identified one or the other will be able to catch both of them? Why don't you go with the older lady first, because often that's more stable. I think you can use that implement. That's
the older lady, this is her hair coming around here. Then this is her nose, and then comes down to her mouth and her chin and goes back up. And this is like some kind of scarf on her head, this big white spot. And this is, I guess, a coat or something. And then the younger lady, oh, this is an eye too for the older lady. The younger lady is her profile. This is her hair coming down. This is her face, and this is maybe interpreted as an ear and a nose here, and maybe some kind of feather coming out of her hair.
okay. So the younger lady is looking away from you. Okay, and the older lady has a fairly sizable chin, which is down into her fur collar or something like that. And we just take space and configure it quite differently. What becomes a mouth for the older lady, we now reinterpret and we make it a necklace or a choker ribbon or something like that around the neck of the younger lady. We're taking the same stimulus and interpreting it in multiple ways, depending on how we isolate things, what we make background, and what we make figure. One of the other interesting reversible figure grounds. Again, I haven't changed anything here. You're changing how you interpret and how you see things in your head. There are a few more principles of perception that we need to go through. Some are perceptual constancies. Do we automatically understand that objects are invariant, they're unchanging out there, regardless of how far away we are from them, what angle we're viewing them from, what light we're viewing them in? And the answer is, by the time we get to be adults or even young children, we're pretty good at this. We know that objects don't change relative to our own position or relative to certain situations. They develop a permanence. We develop perceptual constancies. We come to recognize that objects have permanent size, permanent shape, color and brightness, and unless somebody moves them from one location to another, an object is going to stay in a location. Perceptual constancies. These are important because were it not for these perceptual constancies, the world would be this buzzing confusion. And so if you view somebody from a different distance, the person would be a different size, kind of like Alice in Wonderland. People would shrink and grow on you. Very confusing to live in that world. Or if you view something from a different angle, you might consider it would have a different shape. Or if you were to view something under different lighting conditions, you might consider, if you didn't have these constancies, a different brightness to it or a different color. Or location. You know, sometimes these things break down on us and we get tricked. An example of a constancy breaking down on us, location constancy. For those of you who drive, you're in lane waiting for a light to change, and the car alongside you starts to edge up. Sometimes you misinterpret that and you think you are sliding back. It's not the car edging up, but now your car is sliding back, and you actually perceive that's happening and you jam on the brakes. That wasn't the case at all. That was location constancy breaking down on us. We misperceived what was going on. So we can fool the perceptual system if we work hard at doing it. And there are optical illusions out there that are designed to fool the perceptual system. But most of the time, it works quite well and it works quite accurately. Some other things that we need to look at are perceptual set and contrast effects. In the beginning, when I talked about selecting, I talked about instructions and expectations. And I mentioned that partly what we see depends on our expectations or what we're used to seeing. And we already saw that in one of the things we looked at. But let's yet try another example of this. What I want you to do is, let's turn that over, for a few seconds, stare at that image on the screen. Okay, somebody want to volunteer what that image is from the class? What have you got there as you look at it?
Man playing saxophone.
Man playing a saxophone. Okay, so here we have man playing saxophone, stare, 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 stare. A couple more seconds. Okay, you've got that. Now, let's cover that up and switch to that. Man playing a saxophone again. No different. Let's try one more thing. What if we got over here now when we look at that? Yeah?
I see a woman's face.
You see a woman's face. Okay, now I'm going to ask you to stare at that for a few seconds. Fix that image well in your brain. Okay, and now we're going to go back to that middle image that you looked at before. It probably looks more like a woman's face than the man playing the saxophone. What have we done to you? Well, what we've done in this case is engaged in perceptual set. Your previous expectations and experience set you to see something. This goes on all the time. We bring our previous expectations to any one situation, our previous experiences, and it means that we are guiding what we're going to perceive and select, and we're going to leave out a whole bunch of other stuff because we're not going to be set to see that. Our expectations are not going to be in play. It happens not only with objects, we're going to see later how this happens with people and how we have expectations that we bring to a situation about people, and we miss a lot of other things about them. And there is yet another effect, which is that of contrast. We judge things in relation to background conditions. Our perception is very relative. It would be hard for us to make judgments about size, for instance, unless we saw things in relation to background. Again, let's take a look at one of the graphics. Can we get this in? We've got two monsters. One monster chasing another monster. And if you're like most people, the monster to the rear looks larger than the monster up front. Why does this happen? What's going on? And would you believe me if I told you that they are really identical in size? Well, I think you're just going to have to trust me on this one, folks. They are identical in size, even though our brain constructs them quite different. If anybody wants, you can have a copy of this graphic and take it home and cut them out and lay one over the other to prove to yourself. But they truly are identical, and yet we don't see them that way. We judge the size to be different, and we judge the size to be different because, one, we perceive the monster in back to be further away from us, and we make compensation for that. And so we enlarge the monster in size, again in our head. And the other thing is we judge things relative to background conditions, and the squares up front are much larger, or the rectangles, than the rectangles in the background. All relative. Okay? I could make myself appear taller by surrounding myself with short people. I could make myself appear shorter by surrounding myself with tall people. How I appear all depends on the people surrounding me. In television, sometimes it's hard to figure out exactly what's going on because you don't always have background cues. And so we're going to see a little bit later on how sometimes absence of background cues or misleading background cues has led people to make erroneous judgments. But we need to now turn to the second major topic that we're going to look at for the balance of our time on perception, and that is person perception. How do we perceive people? And what carries over from object perception, and what makes perception of people different? Well, first of all, people are far more complex than objects. They're more complex because they're more dynamic. Objects are rather static. People change. But beyond that, people are capable of intentional actions. A table is a table, is a table. But a person changes. And these intentional actions on the part of the person makes our perception of that person all the more difficult and complex. Our judgments about people are also colored by third-hand reports. We hear so much about people from our friends before we meet them, or they're colored by what we read in the media, newspapers, what we hear on television. And so we come to build impressions of people before we even meet the people. Ah, that thing perceptual set, already in motion. And so that's in process a lot. And finally, it's difficult to determine the accuracy of our perceptions about people. We don't have that thermometer out there that we wish we had to measure all the characteristics about people that we're always making judgments about. Don't we wish that there were some thermometer in which we could measure somebody's personality, somebody's intelligence, somebody's compassion, somebody's attractiveness? But there are none of those out there. Not the same way that we can use a ruler to measure the size of a table. Not the same way that we can use a scale to measure the weight of an object. So we have then objective indicators on objects. We're going to want to know if our perceptions of people are accurate too. We're going to need to rely on something. And typically what we're going to fall back on, since we don't have those nifty little indicators out there to measure all of those abstract traits that I mentioned before, is just agreement. Do other people agree with us? We constantly are checking our perceptions of people with what other people are perceiving about people to see if we're accurate. Only way that we know it is the check with somebody else. Now we will see that there's a lot of agreement about certain things, but when we catch something out of the ordinary, again, we go to our friends and we said, what do you make of this? Did you catch what that person said? And we check our perceptions against somebody else's to try to gauge accuracy. how is it that we come to organize our social perceptions? Well, we're going to look at 4 ways of organizing the information that we get: primacy effects, halo effects, contrast effects, and negative versus positive information. What can we say about those? With primacy effects, we're looking at the way that information we gather initially affects our long-range perception of people. First impressions. Can we change that? We know that the first information we get is fairly powerful. Can we shift our later impressions and change them? How easy is it to do it? How difficult is it to do it? Well, to give you some idea, I want to relate some research that was done by a psychologist out in California several years ago by the name of Rosenhan. Rosenhan and several of his graduate students wanted to see what it would be like on the inside of an institution for people who were experiencing mental difficulties, psychological problems, but severe psychological problems. And so he and about 7 or 8 of his graduate students decided to go to different hospitals and under aliases, but basically everything else being correct, related the following incident: that they were hearing voices coming to them from the radio. Now, I'm not talking about Don Imus or Howard Stern talking to you from the radio. I'm talking about voices directed to the person from some alien force. This we usually call a hallucination, okay? An auditory hallucination. A severe indicator, or an indicator of severe mental illness. Everything else that they gave was basically truthful. All of them were hospitalized, and all of them were hospitalized with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. This is a very severe psychological or mental illness, really severe. It deals with detachment from reality, and people who are schizophrenic are often institutionalized because they simply cannot cope with the outside world, and they very often experience delusions and hallucinations. After they got inside the hospital, they started to keep logs of what it was like, and they no longer reported the auditory hallucinations. At first they kept the logs secretly, but then they began to realize that nobody cared, and they kept logs right out in the open. I guess from the perspective of the orderlies and the other staff, it was just another indicator of some poor person undergoing some psychological problem. And then they wanted to get out. Well, getting in was easy. Getting out was another story. Couldn't get out so easily. Then they began to tell actually what they'd done. And psychiatrists, psychiatric social workers, psychiatric nurses, nobody believed them. I mean, who would ever do such a crazy thing? That was even more proof that they were psychotic. And so they had to call upon wives, friends, girlfriends, boyfriends, other family members to intervene and get them out of the hospital. In every instance, they were released with the prognosis schizophrenia in remission. What that means is, well, you're acting okay now, but any minute, who knows? It could come back again. And not one instance was a doctor, psychiatric social worker, psychiatric nurse willing to admit a mistake on the impression. Rosenhan goes to part 2 of the study. He goes to yet another hospital and relates what he did. And the staff of that hospital said, well, you might have been able to fool other admitting staffs, but you can't fool us. So he said, okay, tell you what, over the next 3 months, I will send you 1 or more of what has come to be known as pseudo-patients? Oh, I don't know, 100 plus. I've forgotten the numbers actually, but say 100 some, 150 some people were admitted during that time. How many were identified, or how many really were pseudo-patients? How many did Rosenhan send as pseudo-patients? Anybody have a guess?
None.
None. None. And yet, this hospital identified a number of those that were sent as pseudo-patients. Okay, and not a trivial number, somewhere in the teens. Again, I haven't looked at the original study in a while, but my recollection was it was somewhere in the teens. And in some instances, there was agreement by two people on the admitting staff that these people were pseudo-patients, and that meant that some doctors were fooled as well in the process. Again, expectations affecting the way people are perceived. Can we escape initial impressions? Can we change them? With a lot of difficulty. Why is it that initial impressions are so lasting? Well, we talked about set before, and we saw set and expectation operating. When we looked at just pictures, the picture of the man playing a sax or a woman, and we saw how initial impressions had effects on later things. We select certain things. We focus on certain things once we have an impression about somebody. And we are skipping a lot of other things about that person. And there's something else that adds into it, which we'll come back and talk about again later when we deal with, oops. Let's just go to this. Okay, the other thing that we will deal with is something called confirmatory bias. Okay, that is, we tend to select information that confirms what we already know. So you have an impression about a person, you select information about that person, you confirm what you know about that person, and we're doing that constantly. Imagine then what effort you have to go through to change that initial impression that you have of somebody. So yeah, you can change it, but you got to add an awful lot of information in there to shift. Better to start on the right foot when you're creating impressions and not work about changing impressions subsequently. Yet another effect that we want to take a look at is something called halo effect. We have general impressions that color our perception of people. Halo effects turn out to be particularly important and come into play when managers are doing performance appraisals of individuals. And very often the general impression you have of an individual is basically colored by whether you like the individual or you don't like the individual. And given that basic liking, disliking, you're more likely to give a person benefit of a doubt on some traits. If you like the person, positive halo, it carries over onto specific traits. You may see the person as being more accurate or more prompt or something than the person really is. Or negative halo, that general impression, if you dislike the person. And so people are not going to get full credit on negative halo for some positive performance, or may not take full blame on positive halo for some negative performance. It's moderated by this whole halo effect, this general impression which carries over into the evaluation of specific traits. Something that has to be watched carefully when you engage in doing performance appraisals to try to make sure that you're giving somebody an accurate appraisal. Yet another effect is that of contrast. In the same way that we judge those little monsters relative to the background that they were in, we judge people relative to backgrounds as well. There is a story, it could be apocryphal, not necessarily true, but a story that remains from a trial that took place out in California, I believe in the 70s. It was the trial of Patty Hearst, who was caught on videotape for a bank robbery and was part of the SLA, or Symbionese Liberation Army. Patty Hearst was the daughter of very, 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 very wealthy people out in California. What was she doing running around with this crowd robbing banks? At any rate, her trial was separated from everybody else. Patty Hearst was probably early 20s at the time, and a very diminutive, very tiny woman. Anyway, the story goes that her lawyers advised her to wear clothing that was one size too big during the trial. Not so that it was perceptibly big, but that it was just big enough to make her look a little bit smaller, a little bit more helpless, to try to manage the impressions of the jury and all of that. We judge things relative to other background features. And yet another piece of research which reveals how we judge things relative actually has to do with some research that was carried out, looking at how people's resumes are judged and how they're judged in terms of interviews. And the finding there was, again, one of relative. If all of the individuals going in for interviews ahead were people who were outstanding, then the person who came in and was average, looked now less than average in comparison to those who were outstanding. And vice versa, it held. If all of the individuals going in ahead of time were rather poor candidates, and then the average candidate walks in, that person appears better than average. We judge people's traits relative, again, to others. So the relative goes on all the time. We like to think very often we're working with some abstract criteria, and we judge people in relation to these abstract criteria that we carry in our heads. We're also judging them relative to other people on physical traits and on psychological traits. So again, there appear to be no absolutes. And finally, I want to talk to you in terms of social perception and one of the organizing principles about negative versus positive information. We seem to key in a great deal on negative information compared to positive information. People could do 100 things positive, and it's the one negative thing that people remember. We go back several presidential elections ago to the Democratic primary, and there was a candidate by the name of Gary Hart who was running. Gary Hart had been a senator from Colorado and done a lot of good things and was fairly personable, except there were rumors about a dalliance that he was having with somebody down in Florida. One, Donna Rice, I believe her name was, and he challenged the press to catch him. The press took up the challenge. The press caught him, as a matter of fact. And for all the good things he'd done, what he's really remembered for is Donna Rice. And that essentially ended his campaign for presidency. Done, finished. We're coming up to another campaign season, and we hear an awful lot about negative campaigning. Why so much negative campaigning? It works. The sad fact is it works in the short run, that people remember this negative information, and you could have all the positive information out there, all the good works that someone has done, and we hang on that bit of negative information. Doesn't seem to make sense. Why do we focus so much on negative information? Let me suggest a reason to you. The reason that I'd like to suggest is that generally, negative information has good survival value for us. You know, a pain is nature's way of telling us, go to the doctor. Toothaches are really compelling in life. They send us to the dentist. It means something needs to get fixed. And we pay attention when people behave in negative ways because it means that something needs to be fixed. We tend to not pay attention. We tend to take for granted a lot of the good things that people are doing because, well, nothing needs fixing. Everything's going okay. It's going okay. It's going okay. I don't need to pay attention to it. And we make assumptions most of the time that stuff is going to go okay. We're all seated carefully in the chair, and you're not even thinking about the chair collapsing underneath you. There's just an assumption. But if there were a certain little wiggle in it that a little bit different, it would call your attention to that negative information. I'm comfortably leaning against the table. I'm assuming it's not going to collapse in back of me. But I would tell you all the time there's some monitoring going on to pick up whether I need to pay attention to something negative. So negative information generally tells us something needs to be fixed. There's survival value to it in other aspects of our life, and we carry it over to the way we perceive people and hang on to it in a lot of areas and focus on negatives over positives. Positives count. Okay, it builds in terms of how we make attributions about people, which is where we're going to ultimately be going next time. But as we wrap up this, let's take a look at a couple of questions that I'd like everybody to reflect on to highlight a couple of the things that we've done today. First question asks, why do we describe perception as a dynamic process? We talked a lot about that in the beginning. And the things that we focused on, if you go back and look over your notes, was the changing aspects of it, the variables that are in it, and the constructive process, how we're constantly constructing things. And because of those features in perception, we call it dynamic. It's not static. It's always changing. And when we talk about person perception, we need to think about why do first impressions have continuing impact. And again, there's carryover there from object perception that set, that expectations, that instructions guide us along certain ways, and this means that we're going to continue to engage in confirming our expectations, and we have continuing impact of these. So we've gone from objects to people, and next time we will be building from impressions that we have to attribution, to how we come to attribute motivations to people for doing the various things that they do.